Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Today's episode is our last show being recorded before Mr. John Gunnison rejoins us, as he's just landed stateside from his time in Qatar and other GCC states visiting the World Cup. So today's episode is with the author of the Substack The Present Age, Parker Molloy. Parker and I sat down and we discussed everything political media. We get into cable news, we get into print outlets like the New York Times and others, and finally, we do discuss Substack. So strap in, consider subscribing to Parker's Substack, which you'll find a link to down on the bottom, and let us know how the show went. All right, well, Parker, thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's great to get able to see you. Last time, I think we did this on Clubhouse or a social audio platform, and now we're on our podcasting platform. So before we get into everything, have you seen any baseball signings? Because I know we're both big baseball fans. Any baseball signings from these winter meetings that you really love, really hate? What is your take so far?
I am a Cubs fan. It's very sad to see that Wilson Contreras, our beloved catcher, has apparently signed a contract with the St. Louis Cardinals, 5 years and whatever it is, $87 million, which is a ton of money, but not in like professional athlete terms.
Yep.
So it's so sad. But that's one that's bumming me out.
It hit you in the feels. He was one of your favorite players, I'm assuming.
Yeah, he was like all that was left.
He was the only good one left.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I saw something that was like, here's like the possible Cubs starting lineup for next season, and it's like, oh God, what is this?
A bunch of rookies and older journeymen. And
yeah, I started collecting baseball cards again after the Cubs traded away Anthony Rizzo and Chris Bryant and Javi Baez a couple seasons back. I was like, I'm gonna buy the rookie cards of all the players they got in that deal, and I'm gonna keep an eye on them. And it's like, the fun thing about baseball cards is if you're not looking for anything special, it's like, yeah, that card's $1. Cool. Go on eBay and you're just like, yeah, I got 15 cards, but it only cost me $8. Don't worry,
because there's like 10,000 players in the league.
Yeah, Other than that, I'm hoping that the Cubs land someone like Carlos Correa or Dansby Swanson. I would like to see them get one of those two, but I don't know if it's going to happen.
To build around, yeah. So for the Red Sox, we have a player, Xander Bogaerts, who everybody wants to re-sign. He's apparently a great guy in the clubhouse, so his teammates like him. He's a great interview. He seems very genuine. He likes it in Boston, which not everybody does. Takes a special kind of person. I just really hope we don't sign him, because in sports, and I don't know if it's similar in politics, but in sports, you're basically paying for past performance. So he's 30 years old. If we give him an 8-year contract, for the last 4 years of it, we're going to be paying for a crappy player, most likely. So not to get too far down the rabbit hole, but that's kind of my heterodox take from a Red Sox fan perspective, because everybody is like browbeating the ownership into signing this player, because the Red Sox sucked last year like the Cubs. Yeah. So that and we will get into heterodox and some folks that maybe made that word popular and are the only reason why I know that word. But as we get into our takes, and I think that this is a great symbolism for what we're going to discuss with political commentators. You and I got into a Twitter argument a while back.
Which one?
We've gotten into several Twitter arguments. The one that I remember, and I had purged my Twitter account since, but it was basically about Mandela Barnes, and there was some endorsement that he thanked Bernie Sanders on Twitter.
That was it, and
we got into a back and forth. And this will also foreshadow our discussion. But we got into a back and forth, and I'm like, well, he's going to lose. He's not a good candidate. And my idea was that he was too progressive. Mm-hmm. So I just want to say, I told you so.
You did tell me so. You know what? I remember that. But I still, the idea that, like, I feel like a Bernie endorsement is less toxic than it sometimes gets made out to be, but he did lose that race. So what can I say? I give that to you.
I wish I wasn't right, because 2024, we need all the, as a Democrat,
Yeah.
we need all the seats we can get. And, it wasn't just the Bernie endorsement. It was the running and not distancing himself from the progressive candidates or electeds like Fetterman did. I'm bringing this to you tongue in cheek, partially, because, as you know, and as I know, like, it's very difficult to point out any one thing with certainty and say this is why an election went this certain way. Because even in the Wisconsin race, right, Mandela Barnes received 1.31 million votes, and Evers, who is more moderate, received 1.358. But they're not running against the same candidate. They're running for Senate and governor, so it's very difficult to compare it. And that really brings me to why I brought this up. It wasn't to say, "Oh, I told you so." It was to get your take on the cable news analysts that we see, and I mean cable news, so that could be Fox or MSNBC and CNN. And I know they're all different, but Parker, after an election or any issue that isn't very binary, that we can say 1 + 1 = 2, this is the outcome. Do we feel like most of these analysts and commentators are giving us honest takes, or are they using the information, the data, to just justify their priors? Help us understand what we're listening to on cable news.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I believe that it's, there are, let's say in a case where it's not obvious why a race went the way it did, because obviously, there are times where you're like, yes, that was the moment that this was lost. But I think that there is a tendency to, among cable news analysts and commentators and talking heads to basically say that the reason things happened was because candidate A did not take on my pet issue, or candidate A talked about too much of it. That comes up a lot. And that's something that I've written about in the past with regards to how, for anyone who doesn't know, I'm transgender. And so that's an issue that I don't necessarily like writing about, but it's everywhere. And after the 2016 election, I remember there were so many pieces that were just like, Hillary was would talk too much about transgender bathrooms, or whatever the case is. And that was just that kind of, in both, in print and on TV, on cable, you had those sorts of arguments being made, and they were kind of just being made without any supporting data. And I mean, happened in 2018 and 2020, there was on MSNBC, you had Claire McCaskill go on there, and this was on election night. I remember watching, and she was saying, like, maybe Biden focused too much on transgender issues. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, we have to focus on the bread and butter and the kitchen, the meat and potatoes, kitchen table issues. And like, yeah, but I mean, when you would actually look at breakdowns of like what candidates were talking about, on the trail, in their ads, stuff like that, it was like, candidates talked about the economy more than anything else. Candidates, whether you're talking about Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or anyone else, talked about immigration and trade and, all of the issues that you hear pundits go, that's what people want to hear more about. The reason that you hear about the other issues, the big focus on those, unless there's something specific that's driving candidate attention to that, like in this past election with overturning Roe versus Wade. I mean, obviously that did make abortion a big topic that was being talked about on the campaign trail. But setting aside instances like that, where there is just more of a normal political atmosphere out there, the perception of, oh, candidate A is talking too much about transgender issues or LGBT rights or whatever issue that they get accused of talking too much about. It's usually just that's what cable news tends to focus on. They focus on these issues that are outside of the mainstream, that are not standard type. This is what you expect from a candidate. They focus on that, and they talk about it more than you'll hear a candidate talk about it. And that is what I kind of find interesting about how cable news specifically, because you have to fill 24 hours of content every day, which is probably too much. one of my issues with it is that that's kind of the reality of it. The world is shaped, you can make any candidate sound super smart, or sound like a complete fool, or make it sound like they only care about issue X, or whatever, just because they choose the programming. They, it gets everything gets chopped up and fed back to us. Whether we're staring at empty podiums of Donald Trump's campaign, like in 2016, which I'm glad that it seems like people mostly realized that was not the best use of airtime, as elections followed after that. But I think that there's a lot of, it really goes underappreciated just how much the media, which again, as we've kind of, you and I both know is an extremely broad term, but the information that we get about the world around us, whether that comes from cable, whether that's in the newspaper or a website or social media, like all of that stuff, it influences us in different ways. And it's fed to us. It's not like we're all just getting a straight feed of what's happening in the world. We're getting what Mark Zuckerberg decides we should be getting, or what Chris Licht at CNN thinks we should be getting. These things matter.
You said, for example, the transgender issues, and when Claire McCaskill, I think in 2016, you mentioned that she blamed that, which is crazy because having worked on the other side for the RNC during that election, that wouldn't have even registered from the Republican perspective as a reason that the race was won. And I say that as somebody who personally in my portfolio at the RNC had LGBTQ issues, and literally I would have refused to say anything, but we did not at the RNC say throughout the whole election, did not put out one piece of opposition research, did not highlight it. And if anything, there was a move by the log cabin Republicans to get Trump, at least for lesbian and gay people, to be more open. And even you had the freaks like Milo. And I'm saying that because Milo is like a freak, not because he's of the LGBTQ community. He was pushing Trump to, but anyway, so that is just shocking to me. And it's interesting because this election now, I think the commentary is the Republicans lost because they're focusing on transgender issues too much. But my question though is, we could do a whole show on that. But when you say they focus on it too much in regards to specifically cable news, is it the commentators like Claire McCaskill? Are they bringing this in on their own, or is it the business model? Like you mentioned Chris Licht or whoever the same person is at MSNBC or Fox, is the station itself driving this coverage because of the business model, or is there something else going on here? Why are quote unquote they focusing on these issues that the candidates aren't?
Sure. That's a great question. And I think that one of the challenges right now in just the entire world of media, if looking at the past couple of weeks, you've had, CNN announces a bunch of layoffs, Washington Post announced layoffs, Protocol, the tech website, just shut down. There is just this long list of places that are laying people off right now, when all over the news media sort of space. And I think that, what that sort of speaks to is just the challenge that exists to try to make news profitable. And that is one of those crazy kind of balances that the people who run these, like, I don't envy anyone who has to make decisions that are meant to take something that informs us and find the balance between that and business, what makes sense business wise to talk about, to cover, to, the way things are dealt with. And obviously, people who are in the newsroom, on the news side of things, they're not supposed to be concerned about the business side of things. That they're, the whole idea is to wall that off, to make the business decisions separate from the news decisions and the editorial decisions. But inevitably, it all comes together, because if you're not getting ratings and you're not getting advertisers, then you're not gonna succeed in this sort of cutthroat, extremely fractured media landscape. Because if you think about it, it used to be there were, like four TV channels, like there was just a handful of news outlets, and that's where you got all the info you need. But now, I mean, I could find some website somewhere that will tell me everything that I believe is totally correct, and everyone who's wrong is totally wrong. And it makes for this weird sort of space where you have to figure out how to walk that line if you want to have a successful business. As after the 2020 election, remember when Fox News called it for Biden? It was on
we had Chris Stirewalt on this show, and he was the one who called Arizona.
Yeah, and then he lost his job later. But after that happened, I was curious. I was checking out, what the responses to that on social media were. And you've probably noticed this too, but during the 2020 election, there were definitely some people on the right who were really trying to say, like, Fox is liberal now. Fox has moved to the left. And basically it was because they weren't Newsmax and they weren't OAN.
Trump was saying that, Parker.
Yeah, Trump was saying that.
That was one of his things.
Yeah, and I mean, in his case, that was his. He was always, he'll say anything to get something to his advantage. He was insulting Fox and hoping
he's full of shit.
Nicer
yes,
to him. Yeah, he's full of shit. That's what he does. That's nothing new. But so after that, you see Fox started going pretty heavy into like advertising, like their opinion stuff. Like after the election, they had an ad campaign that was focused on Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham and Sean Hannity. Like, we'll tell you don't worry. It was basically like, we're trying to reassure you, we'll be there. Remember how we were during the Obama administration? We're going to be just like that again, like that sort of thing. So I think that a lot of this, is just that selling people on news, which can be extremely dry and boring, doesn't necessarily pay the bills. I mean, the more sensational, the more people pay attention. The more it confirms their priors, the more they'll keep watching. Like if you tune into TV and every single night they're like, "Hey, that thing you believe, you're wrong," like, you're not going to feel as energized about checking it out, because most people watch TV for entertainment and not so much like, I'm here to learn about the world, So I think that there's that aspect of it where you start to have all of these weird little incentives to try to move things to placate your audience, to keep them happy, because you don't want to lose your audience. You don't want Fox clearly was a little worried about losing some of its audience to Newsmax and OAN. And so it started, it started kind of pushing back on that. And the voices of reason over there, you had, Shep Smith, he was out because he pushed back on something that Tucker Carlson said. And you kind of saw that happen, over a span of months, and it's been going on ever since, all over the place. And then when Newsmax called the election, when they finally acknowledged it on Twitter, there were all these responses that were just like, you sold out. Like, It was like mid-December at that point when they finally were like, okay, the Electoral College has met and Biden has the votes. And there were people who were just angry, who were like, how dare you? How dare you say that he won? And it's like people want to be entertained, and so they kind of, they build their own bubbles, but also these news organizations, whether you're talking Fox or CNN or MSNBC or anywhere else, it's like they know that they need to keep their viewers happy as well, because happy viewers are viewers who come back and keep watching your channel. It's really kind of a weird incentive structure.
So considering the business model and incentive structure is perverse in that it's, in some ways, I think you would argue, I would argue, everybody would argue, it's distorting the objective facts, whether it be the way the facts are presented or the emphasis on those specific facts and the airtime given to them. And considering that it's because the money that needs to be made, is there any type of positive role that cable news media can play in our political ecosystem? Or is this something that we should turn off? And I say that as somebody who loves a good horse race coverage. And I'm embarrassed to admit that. My co-host, who's in Qatar right now, would just roll his eyes and they'd fall out the back of his head because he hates it. So I do get my fix every once in a while of cable news. But should we just be turning it off? Or is there a, realistically speaking, Parker, not in our, with our magic wands and hopeful, is there a constructive role that it can play?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's possible. It may be unlikely, but possible in the current structure that there is. The one thing, in seeing CNN's news about CNN's layoffs, for instance, recently, one of the things that was said there, and it's hard to tell how much of this is just company trying to make things sound better than they are, and how much of it's like the actual plan, but one of the groups of people that CNN was making big cuts to, one of the sections were the paid contributors, the people who show up on air, the Rick Santorum types, which that doesn't make sense. He's been gone for a while, but
he said something racist.
Yeah, the people in those roles who, former politicians and analysts and stuff like that, where they're kind of brought on to talk about all the subjects, all the topics. That is the part of cable news that drives me up a wall, because we don't learn anything. The people on there brought on to talk about, whatever let's see, Van Jones, for instance. You bring Van Jones on to talk about every single issue under the sun, and it's just okay, maybe he's an expert in certain areas but not others, but why is he always on here to talk? Why are we just hearing what are essentially random opinions of varying levels of being informed? Why are we hearing these from a panel of 7 people or whatever?
Because he's really good at talking.
He is good. He was in one of the Purge movies. I like to point that out.
I did not know that.
He was in the movie The First Purge, where
Really, I missed that. I will go back.
Not the first Purge movie, but the movie that is called The First Purge, which was like the third.
Oh, okay.
Got to keep it weird. It was the prequel. So I think that there's an opportunity to go back to doing awesome reporting, primarily keeping that the focus. On the plus side, it gets away from a lot of the partisan stuff that happens. It gets away from the talking points and the talking heads. I mean, because that's what you're essentially getting rid of. However, you do lose the arguments that go viral on social media and stuff like that, which again speaks to some of the bad incentive structures that exist.
And one of them that will stick with me, and I thought it was funny and cool when I listened to it, but now I just think he's kind of a scumbag, was when Rick Wilson was on Don Lemon's show on CNN. He told a Trump person he'd gut him like a fish. And that clip just went viral. And like, as I've matured, I'm like, this guy just sucks. But that's just making your point though, because that went viral and that's what I remember
Yeah.
from it. Don't remember what they were talking about, but I do
No.
remember that.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where you watch these things and you're either feeling like this rush of endorphins because you agree with what you're seeing. You're like, yeah, tell them, or
that's what I felt too.
Yeah. Or on the flip side, someone will be sitting there stewing in anger. Like, these sorts of emotions are so detached from the idea of learning what's happening in the world today. Like, that is the entertainment aspect of it. So I am cautiously optimistic about what could happen with cable news at some point if it shifts more away from that. Now, that said, I have no clue what CNN's actually going to do. I was kind of pleasantly surprised that when they moved Don Lemon to the morning show, because his show was an opinion show. I mean, his primetime show was an opinion show, and then in the run up to the midterms, they had Jake Tapper have a primetime show where it was not opinion. It was just it was news. There were like report. He would do really interesting reports.
I was going to ask you about him because he's my favorite on cable news because I think he's the most serious, and maybe that's because I like his perspective and point of view, and that's my bias. But I also think that generally speaking, he's the one that has the fortitude to ask the difficult questions. Whether it's him or his producers, probably a combination thereof. They think of the tough follow-ups and they're asking them on the spot. So I did want to get your opinion about that and his show in the lead up to the election there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a really interesting experiment that CNN kind of did by putting his show there. And I mean, it was very similar in format to, his the lead, his other show. But I really liked it because I watched it and felt smarter, felt as though I had learned something, which is not something that I typically take away from any sort of cable news. And I really do appreciate his approach to journalism just generally. I don't always agree with his takes, and because he does express his views on things, but still kind of keeps, he really will press people all over the political spectrum on issues and get you answers that others don't. I mean, one thing that will always stick in my head is this interview he did with Trump in 2016, where it was right after Trump had made that comment about how the judge who was overseeing the Trump University case, the
Mexican American judge,
it was like, he can't be, we can't trust him to do this. He's a Mexican. And it's like, oh my God, what the hell? So Tapper asks him about that. Like, and Trump kind of like dodges and he goes, well, the case should have been over. And he tries to pivot to talking about Hillary's emails or whatever, and Tapper just kept following up, and he followed up. It was something like, I think it was like 16 or 17 times on that same question.
Wow. I did not know that.
While he never really got a satisfactory answer out of Trump, he didn't move on. And it was so clear that Trump was just not liking that. He was not having that. He's used to how cable news tends to be, where if you don't answer, they go, well, okay, we'll move on. And then, you get the question that you want and you go from there. So I really appreciated that, especially given that it came with a cost. I mean, do you know how many times he's interviewed Trump ever since then? 0.
Yeah.
0. He has never, ever interviewed Trump since. And, he interviewed a lot of people in the Trump administration, but Donald Trump has never sat for an interview with him. And that, I think, is, after that one, which, I think that might be one of the best things that, as a journalist, would be to have people who, who are, bullshitters, who will go, I don't want to talk to this person because they're going to ask me hard questions. I make them afraid of you in that sort of way, in this, like, it's going to be a challenge kind of way. And when you're talking, like, when you're talking about someone who the president of the United States or running for president, yeah, they should be able to sit down for interviews that are uncomfortable and answer difficult questions. And I would, and the interviews that we'll all look back on and think about years from now will not be the ones that where it's conservative news group like lobbing softballs to Trump. No, it'll be Jonathan Swan interviewing Trump and pressing him on various issues. It will be the Jake Tapper interview. Like, those are the ones that they stick out because they're rare. That's bad. It's bad that those are rare. I want someone to just really not let up. That's what I think good journalism really is. I'd love to see candidates just kind of torn to shreds. Like, here's everything. We're not going to let you go through your talking points. You're going to stay on topic, or we're going to have a very awkward conversation, like that sort of thing. And I think that can be, that can be great. And I am glad to see that sort of work rewarded in various ways. Like, I may not always agree with Jonathan Swan or Jake Tapper, but I can appreciate their work, their style of work.
I was going to say, Parker, it sounds like you've come over to my side of the road and you've become a center left moderate.
Center left moderate.
The praise of these folks. So you're warming my heart.
I'm gonna get canceled. Insufficiently far left.
No, I agree with everything you said. And we've done probably 300 of these shows with 40 or 50 members. And it's hard. If you have a platform like CNN, though, where folks want to come on and get something from you, then it should be easier. But doing these interviews, you can hear people starting to get frustrated, and you're like, oh boy, they're just going to say, fuck this and hang up. But one where we did that, and I thought the answer was great, was Congresswoman Nancy Mace. It was the day after or the day of Kevin McCarthy got caught lying, and the New York Times came out and they're like, we have recordings of what you said about President Trump. And there was this whole thing. So we asked her, like, why do you support him? And we asked her a couple follow-ups, like, how can you trust anything he says when he's a known liar? How can the American people trust? And she basically ultimately gave a good, heartfelt, honest answer, which was, he's supporting me in a tough primary, so I support him, which is like, okay, that's fine. Like, that's what we want. I don't care what the answer is. Just make it an honest one.
Yeah.
I don't have to agree with it. And I think that our media would be a lot better if folks took that approach. And I highlight that one to say that's one example where we've probably failed 300 other times. So, but I understand what you're saying there. And I wanted to just to close up the loop on cable news. One of my best friends, probably my best friend in Washington, D.C., is Andrew Lawrence, and he hangs out with my dog Brady. We go to sports games together. We hang out a lot. And one thing that he hates, and you hate this too, is both sidesism.
Yes.
So I was hoping you could briefly get into, especially on cable news, what is both sidesism, because it's not having a Republican and Democrat on. So could you just get into what it is? And for people that don't read The Present Age, which is one of two Substacks that I am a paying member of, could you just get into it for the audience about what it is and why it's so frustrating?
Sure. So essentially, both sidesism is this sort of idea that on every issue, on every topic, there will be two equally good positions, and either could be fine, either are correct. We can't say, some people say the sky is blue, and but others say that it's actually made of cheese. I don't, like these sorts of like, if you treat both of those things as though they're both valid positions, then that is kind of, an exaggerated version of both sidesism, but for instance, a real life example would be how climate change was covered for a very long time, where you would have stories on TV, and and in papers that would go, well, on one hand, you have 97% of climate scientists, and on the other, you have 3% of climate scientists.
And Louis Gohmert.
Yeah, and Louis Gohmert. And so we're going to hear from someone who works for an oil company. Like these sorts of things where you give both of those equal weight. And on one hand, like I can see a reason that might be where that might be good. If you really, if you to get into one of our vocabulary words here, you want to have a heterodox approach to everything happening in the world, and you want to try to dig into something a little bit and maybe expose some flaws. That's kind of the dream of journalism, is to get in there and find some answers and change the world through asking questions and stuff like that. But I could see there being situations where you're like, sure, an overwhelming majority of people think A, but let's hear the argument for B. And that can be done in a smart, thoughtful way. But that might mean making it clear repeatedly that the majority believe A, and and these are experts who say this, and we're gonna really try to poke holes in point B, but we're gonna let them have their say here. Like that is one thing, but too often it ends up being like, all right, so we're gonna read the press release from this oil company, and we're going to get a quick soundbite from a climate scientist, like those sorts of things. And it's just obnoxious because it requires a level of reading and viewing comprehension that most people don't put into their media consumption. That just doesn't happen. Most people, when they see an article, they don't click past the headline. They see a headline, that's it. There was a study that it was like, I think it was like from like 2010, so it's so outdated right now. But it was a study that found that something like 60% of people who got their news online were only looking at headlines. They weren't looking at the whole articles. They weren't reading them start to finish. And the thing is that people who work in media, whether pretty much at any level, they know that that's how it works. They know that most people will only go with what the headline says. If your headline just says like, here's this controversial thing that has it's divisive and it has people split, you're going to kind of assume that it's a 50-50 split, not a 97 to 3 split. So that sort of thing, that sort of framing, a lot of that is a failure of how you write headlines and how you really kind of set up stories. And I think that a few years ago I wrote a piece that was just like, headlines are broken. We've got to rethink this, because for the most part, a lot of headlines were written in this, and I know I've shifted from TV to print.
No, that's okay. That's where we're going.
Headlines on news stories were kind of written in a way that they would be in a newspaper, and they never changed when it switched to the internet. In a newspaper, when you're reading, you're on the opinion pages. When you get there, it says opinion all over the place, and you see the headline, and immediately below the headline, without you having to click or turn a page or do anything else, you start seeing the article, which usually gives you some additional clues. So like the information we take in, we kind of start factoring it all in looking at just this portion of a page. And that is already better than seeing that same exact headline just floating on a tweet or on Facebook or even just on a website. It's headlines have been written for this print media world that has shifted so much to digital. Most people aren't going out and buying the print New York Times. They're going to nytimes.com. That's kind of the reality of it.
Or they're just scrolling. And I think your 60% stats probably even worse now because, and I'm guilty of this sometimes too, is just scrolling through Twitter and seeing a journalist post an article and then you see the headline and it's like, it's stunning, but you get people responding to the article and they'll say, oh, this based on the premise of the headline, this is terrible. How could you? And then the journalist responds, did you read the article? Question mark. I made the exact opposite point. Like it says the exact opposite thing. So I totally hear you and I agree with you. Before we go any deeper, I was hoping that we could get into specifically. So cable news, I think we've discussed the business model. I think that we mentioned it's 24 hours a day. So it's largely focused on breaking news and providing a visual component to whatever the information is. What type of role ideally does print journalism fill? And I'm specifically not Substack. We'll get to that. I'm thinking the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, the credible fourth estate institutions. It has to be different from your perspective than what cable news does.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. I think one thing that the print media just generally does really well or can do really well is investigative reporting. I mean, these like long deep dive type pieces, that is what they do best. That is not typically the realm of cable news. That is, that because it lends itself so much better to, these stories that you can put out over the course of several days and put them in put them in their own special section and to put them on the front page, like all of these different things to kind of highlight different issues. And really get deep into the weeds with a lot of this stuff because, especially if you're writing about something that has, a ton of facts and figures, like that doesn't lend itself well to podcasts or radio or TV. Much better for, looking at a website with a great, New York Times and Wall Street Journal both have really great visual
infographics.
Yeah, like really immersive kind of things that they've done great work with. And I think that is a type of innovation and how these places that do these deep dive reports, the Wall Street Journal example I'm thinking of is from last year, the Facebook papers thing that they had, where it was just like a big multi-day breakdown of a lot of what was happening inside Facebook, and it was very interesting, and it was framed in such a way that was that really lent itself well to a newspaper as opposed to Twitter or TV or Substack. So that I think that's kind of the big role that those institutions can play, but it's so tricky when so much of I think that when people look at what pays the bills and what drives traffic and what drives subscriptions, a lot of times it ends up being the opinion stuff, the stuff that that's kind of the filler, the candy that pays the bills so you can afford to do the deep dive investigations.
I was just gonna say that if you're running your own Substack, you can't just spend your time on these investigations, because even at news outlets, we had Ken Vogel on the show. It's a money sink. It's a money pit,
Yeah.
because you have to, you have these large investigative teams, and we were talking about downsizing. That has been something that has been downsized across the country, and you really just have these bastions like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. When you were mentioning everything, I was thinking of the investigative journalism they did on Tucker Carlson, and they had I think it was Nick Confessori. Anyways, they had like infographics about the times he used extreme language around immigrants, and there was red bubbles, and it's just coming to my mind right now in a very visual manner, which not great for a podcast because it's hard to describe the picture that we're both pulling up in our brains. But that is to say, folks love to criticize the New York Times. And right now we're extolling their virtues on investigative journalism and leaving access journalism aside. So leaving the political reporting, which is also very valuable for a variety of reasons. When we're criticizing the New York Times, when you're criticizing the New York Times on the present age, is that because of the opinion section, or is it because of the access journalism? Explain where you get most of your angst and agita when just reading the New York Times and saying, this is shit.
Yeah. I think a lot of it. So first off, it's like, I do think that the opinion section's kind of a mess, because they haven't really, there after the 2016 election, there was this kind of push to try to understand Trump voters. So they were like, we're going to go out, we're going to, and this is kind of a mistake that I think a lot of places fell into, where they were like, we want to understand Trump voters, so we're going to go out and hire some people who are more conservative than we typically would hire.
And we're going to pay for them to go on a diner safari.
Yeah. So the New York Times goes out and hires Bret Stephens and Barry Weiss from the Wall Street Journal's opinion pages. And that would be great, except for the fact that neither of them supported Trump. They're conservatives, but they were not Trump supporters. So any goal of trying to understand Trump supporters and to appeal to Trump supporters, probably, like, all that you ended up doing there, all that the Times ended up doing there, was kind of just making their opinion page more conservative and not doing whatever sort of outreach they think that they were doing at the time. And so I think that that's kind of, opinion pages, I think a lot of the times what they do is they suffer from the same challenges that the big TV panels suffer from, where you have people who aren't experts on topics talking about those topics. You have, what was it? There was one time Bret Stephens was writing about, he had a whole thing about how people were mean to him on Twitter, and he got mad and found that someone called me a bed bug, and then he deleted his Twitter account. It was a whole thing, and it's just like, why is this being printed in the New York Times? What is
the paper of record is talking about, like, Twitter meanies.
So many, like, opinion pieces should really just be conversations with therapists and not not columns, but too often that's kind of what you get. But also, I think that, you also kind of nailed the other aspect of this, which is the access aspect of it, which comes from a place of the media being so fragmented these days. Like, if you look at what, the formation of the White House Correspondents Association, their origin story was, and oh God, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but I think it was President Wilson had was basically threatening to exclude some outlets, essentially, from briefings. And it was really all of these like journalists who covered the White House banding together and being like, you can't cut them out or we're all going. And so that was kind of the threat. That was the way to have a little bit of leverage. Like, you need us to get your message out to the people, and we're not going to let you mistreat our colleagues here. And that, I think, was really interesting and really important at the time. However, as time goes on now, again, with all of the various outlets, we're starting to sort of enter this age of politicians just realizing they don't need the press, don't need media, don't need mainstream media, at least. And one example of that is Ron DeSantis. I mean, it had a thing at the, I forgot, it was some sort of convention in Florida over the summer.
Was it CPAC?
No, it wasn't CPAC. It was like the Sunshine stuff. It was something that the Florida Republican Party put on.
Okay.
And basically they just rejected press requests from all sorts of papers. Like New York Times, no, you can't come. Associated Press, no. Yeah, I think Politico got in. But other than that, it was a lot of just right-wing media covering it. And they were saying, like, no, we're locking you up, that we're not going to have you in here doing this. And it's interesting because we're at this point where, yeah, he doesn't need to necessarily, do interviews with the New York Times. He doesn't have to talk to the Washington Post, or he can just talk to friendly outlets. That's what Donald Trump mostly did. That's what, Trump would do occasional things with mainstream outlets because I think he felt like he had to, but I don't know that that's necessarily going to keep being the case. So to try to avoid that, you have places that are trying to be a little more friendly to candidates, to try to be like, no, you can trust us to not write bad things about you, which already you're starting to kind of affect the balance here, the incentive structure here, and you end up in that same sort of place that that people are on the business end, where you're like, if I'm too harsh, what if they won't give me an interview? Or if I write something negative, will they stop talking to our outlet completely? And so when CBS hired Mick Mulvaney to be, like, if you think about the things that Mick Mulvaney said when he was in Trump's White House, he said, well, first he, of course, wrote that Wall Street Journal op-ed that was said, like, if Trump loses, he'll concede gracefully. That did not hold up. He's the same one who, that when Trump was being impeached for the first time over extorting Ukraine to try to get them to investigate Biden, he said he told journalists to get over it, which was like, come on. And then he's also the one that in February 2020, like, he said that the only reason that the press was cared about the coronavirus was because it was the hoax of the day. So, like, those are three things that are just so very, very wrong on a journalism sort of level. And then CBS goes and hires him. And there was the Washington Post, obtained a recording that basically was like, hey, we think the Republicans are going to probably win in the midterms, and we need to make sure that we have some ins over there. We have to make sure that we have access. And it's just, it's a losing proposition. It's a difficult sort of, it's a difficult game that they have to play, and I understand why, but in the end, I think what it ends up doing is it creates kind of a credibility vortex down to nothing. You start kind of chipping away at it, when you start elevating people like Mick Mulvaney and putting him on TV, and hiring reporters who will be a little gentle with certain candidates so as not to lose them. But in the end, you kind of have to hope that there are enough outlets willing to take that sort of stand that the White House Correspondents Association in its very beginning did to try to keep credibility in the front, because the issue with people not trusting the press isn't going to get better by just trying to make politicians happy. Politicians will never be happy. They will always want things
only unless you're their propaganda outlet.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That's kind of what political PR is. And just a quick story anecdote on Mick Mulvaney. So my former boss when I was a Republican was Tim Huelskamp, and he was a Catholic Republican, but Freedom Caucus. And this is back in 2014, 2015, when Mick Mulvaney was there. And anyways, we were drinking at Tortilla Coast, which is no longer there. And it was a fundraiser for Congressman Huelskamp. I believe the Coke Industries were there, and maybe they were even throwing it. But me and Congressman Mulvaney got into an argument, and it was a heated argument. And this was like my first week or month on the job, and we were going back and forth at each other. And this is just to show you that he, in my opinion, he really does believe this shit. We were arguing about Greg Hardy, who, for everybody in the audience, is a former defensive end. So he's like 6'6", 250 pounds, pure muscle, for the Carolina Panthers. And ultimately, he got in trouble, was found guilty on a bench trial of beating the shit out of his like 5'0" girlfriend at the time. And the pictures of the violence that he inflicted, this world-class athlete, turned into an MMA fighter, actually. on this woman were disgusting, and nobody was defending him. No, and eventually the Panthers let him go. Mick Mulvaney was sitting across at a table to me, a friendly staffer, and he was defending Greg Hardy, saying,
Oh no.
no, my brother, South Carolina, he knows the owner, Jerry Richardson.
Oh.
Later, Jerry Richardson had to sell the team because he got in trouble for racist statements against black people, might have been black players. But Mick Mulvaney was adamant that Greg Hardy was innocent and that there's nothing wrong there. And it just goes to show you, like, I think that there's some type of conspiracy theory going on where he thought that the media was contriving something to ostracize this player that he had the inside scoop on. But he was like one of the only people at the time defending this guy. And he was a leader of the Freedom Caucus, which went on to literally dethrone Speaker John Boehner and help choose the next Speaker of the House. But that is just to show that his views are genuinely out there. And if CNN's only hiring those views not to have them on the air, but to get access, and as a result, you have these views on the air, then the system kind of is, I would argue, broken, like you're saying.
Yeah. And I think you meant CBS
Sorry,
at the end.
what did I say? CNN?
CNN, but
okay.
Yeah. But yeah, and yeah, I remember with Greg Hardy, that whole thing where he ended up getting getting signed by the Cowboys, and then then I think he got suspended again and was out. But
because he's a freak.
Yeah, I mean, like that's the thing. I remember those pictures, and I remember it being
it was bad.
It was really bad. I mean, that was right around, I think, the same time as the Ray Rice thing with the elevator. Which,
Yep.
So I think there was maybe this sense that it was like, oh, everyone's under attack, and and now they're coming for this. But don't worry, we got to the bottom of the elevator thing because Robert Mueller was on the case, which is why nothing ever came of that. So,
oh well, I went to Robert Mueller's high school, and he's the reason why I got into public service.
When it's just so funny that it's just like when he got named special counsel, I was like, the guy who screwed up the Ray Rice investigation. That was my the guy who had a video of Ray Rice beating his wife and couldn't find anything.
Did he have the video? I don't
remember, but I just like reminding people. I'm like, yeah, no, he was the same guy who's behind that when people were really like, no, it's Mueller time. It's like, it's not.
Well, resistance Twitter is, and that's where I'll take it. That's a whole different. It's like a fandom rather than like it's people cheering for. It's like if I showed up here and I was like, the Cubs are going to win the World Series this year. It's like I could be forgiven for being a Cubs fan and optimistic about my team, but that would be just me trying to play up my team and not like actually look at the reality of it. And there's not, from my perspective, okay, the end game may be different, but that type of fandom isn't too different. That fervor, I guess I would say, isn't too different from the fervor that we see following around the big Substackers and the heterodox thinkers, right? I'm thinking Glenn Greenwald. I don't know what happened with The Intercept. I think he got fired or something, or he quit. But then he creates this Substack, and I'm assuming he's making millions of dollars at it. Matt Taibbi, I saw somewhere, is making $2 million a year on Substack. Then Barry Weiss, I think there was a New York Times article or some mainstream article saying how successful she is at making money at this stuff. And these people, for the most part, are just, from my perspective, I don't read them all the time, but they're conspiracy theory adjacent or conspiracy theory period. And they're speaking to a bunch of people who just generally do not trust the establishment, do not trust all the media that we just spoke to. So why are they able to leverage the platform of Substack, which you have, I'll name your show later, so it's not associated with this stuff, which you have your own outlet that's very successful on? Why is it so conducive to these, crypto freaks and all the other people?
Well, I think that the type of content that does really well on Substack is opinion content. I mean, It's the which is why it's such a challenge to why there haven't really been any big Substackers who have come out with like really great investigative journalism, because it's difficult. It takes time. That was kind of the initial idea, I think, for like Hunter Walker, who he was at Yahoo for a while, but then he started his own Substack, and then he would do these he was doing some investigative reporting into the January 6th and the planning of that, and he had a lot of those things. But then when it came time to publish those, he tended to publish them at like Rolling Stone because it got the distribution that went along with being from Rolling Stone. So like that's kind of the challenge, where it's hard to actually turn that into a platform for investigative work, because there are better options to put it out there. Now, when it comes to churning out some opinions, because doing an investigation where you have to do a bunch of interviews and all of that takes time, that takes energy, but if Glenn Greenwald gets upset about something, he sees someone online who makes him mad, and he decides he wants to write a newsletter about it, he can sit down and churn one out in an hour and send it off. And I think that it's that sort of it's like an extension of social media more than it is a real place for like full on journalism, and I think that is one of the reasons that they resonate with people, is that they write opinions that people agree with. The people who follow them do so not because like they're great writers or anything. I mean, they're all good or above average writers, probably.
Not that hard to be an above average writer, right?
Yeah, it's like they are fine writers.
I'm an above average writer, Parker.
Yeah. Like they're fine writers, and they all had pre-existing followings. That helps too, obviously. But that's, it really comes down to people, the think about how content succeeds on Twitter. The stuff that you see, the voices you constantly hear, every day. For instance, I see this Nick Adams dude in my timeline, because people can't resist retweeting him, even though he's just a weird right-wing troll.
He is a troll, and it's kind of funny, some of it, the Starbucks stuff.
Yeah, he'll just be like, I was in a Starbucks and like people aren't taking their kids to Hooters enough these days. Like that's his whole thing, and I'm just like,
and then I didn't even get a coffee, and I just left.
I just walked out. This person, their name badge, it said they/them, and I was like, not today. Like that sort of stuff. Like
standing up for America, and I just left. It's like, no, asshole, you just didn't get yourself a coffee. But he's also making it up.
Yeah, like, so just how that sort of stuff is not great tweeting or great writing. You're not learning anything, but it gets a lot of interactions. It's kind of the same, when people say incendiary things online. I mean, Charlie Warzel, who he was at the New York Times, then he started a Substack called Galaxy Brain, and then the Atlantic hired him to take Galaxy Brain to the Atlantic
newsletter.
Like when that happened, he had this. There was one time he has one old post where basically he got like Glenn Greenwald got like angry at him online for something because he criticized him, and then he wrote like a post that was just about that little online argument, and he said it was like the best day for his new subscriptions, because it was controversial, and it brought his annual revenue up. And it's like that's so it's one of those things where you try to figure out what the balance is between like what you want to write about and what you care about and what you need to write about in order to sort of keep yourself afloat. And I mean, maybe they just genuinely like writing about.
That's where I was going next. Well, first off, I have like 2,000 Twitter followers, and Glenn Greenwald has gotten mad at me and done a tweet thread on me. Yeah. So that's insane.
Sometimes he doesn't seem to have a great like understanding of the like proportional response.
I find it hilarious. It's like, dude, you're such an asshole. If I'm getting with my 2,000 followers, if I'm the big bad liberal establishment, which so fuck Glenn Greenwald. I need to say that very clearly and unequivocally. Why do they write this stuff? So do these and specifically like TB and Weiss with the Twitter files, which is nothing. It's completely nothing. Why are they doing this?
Now, to be clear, there may be something eventually. I don't know, but so far after the first round of it or whatever, it's like there's nothing like super newsworthy. And I always want to like, I'm open to like, if there's a big scandal, like that's cool. Let me know, let everyone know. But it seems so politically motivated. I think they write the things they do and they say the things they do because they believe them, but
Okay.
but also it's finance. It works out for them financially. I mean, if you look at what Taibbi's like, his Twitter follower count went up by like 700,000 followers, and yeah, he's now at like 1.3 million or something. He was at 500,000 before. So I mean, it's just massive. It's massive. And the thing is that there is no there is such a thing as bad press, but it's not necessarily the case. The big game here is name recognition and trying to get your voice out to as many people as possible, because even if only 1% of the people who hear your argument agree with it, if you're hitting a billion people, like that's still a whole bunch. Like that is still, you are still getting through to a massive crowd that now likes your work and will share your work, and it will help and it will build on it. I think about sometimes I'll like I often try to avoid writing about issues about LGBTQ issues and trans issues, because I find so much of it so obnoxious, because so much of it I've written before. But I like to kind of tell people that sometimes it's like those will be the posts that do really well for me sometimes. And, those will be the posts that sometimes get me invited on podcasts or TV, and TV appearances help with the subscriptions, and the podcasts help with the subscriptions, like these sorts of things. I find myself in like, have you seen the movie, the Nightmare Before Christmas? Like, I feel like everyone has.
I might have.
Okay. That's okay. So
what's the premise?
in this movie, you've got Jack Skellington. He is a skeleton. He is the king of Halloween Town. And so but he's getting bored. And so he accidentally travels to Christmas Town. And he's like, Christmas is awesome. And he sees it and he's like, there's presents and I love it and everything's great. So he goes back to Halloween Town. He's like, we're going to do Christmas now. And so he tries to sell the town on also doing Christmas in addition to Halloween. Like that's his thing. He's like, we're going to take over from Santa and we're going to do it. And the town is confused. The town's like, there aren't any spiders and there aren't any horrible goblins under the beds and stuff like that. Like, why are we doing that? And he's like, oh, so he kind of like looks away and he's like, okay, I guess I better give them what they want. And then so he's like, Santa has a big mighty voice and claws for arms, like he starts telling them what they want to hear, because but it's all to get to his final goal of doing Christmas. And it doesn't work out for him in the end. He screws up Christmas. But that's kind of the sort of feeling I sometimes have when I'm like, oh, I guess I have to write about this thing. There was another bad op-ed about trans people. I suppose I should write about that, or I should address whatever issue. When I'd really rather be digging into the state of news media as a whole, as it's all this part of the same information ecosystem, which it just fascinates me. But at the same time, it's like, got to pay the bills and you got to try to, and obviously it's like, I only write things I believe and think about, but time is limited, and one of the great things about writing a newsletter is like, you can choose how to spend it. I can decide, okay, I'm going to go heads down and not write anything for 2 weeks and work on like a long piece. But if I do that in that 2 week period, I'm going to lose a lot of subscribers. I'm going to have people who are paying subscribers who may go, you're not putting out content, I need to go. Which, to be fair, like, that's fair. That does totally make sense. So there's that balance you end up finding yourself in, and all of the sort of issues that we talked about before with, like, trying to do that balancing act of, the wall between business and editorial when you are handling the whole thing yourself as someone who is, writing a newsletter. You end up having to take all of these thoughts into consideration. But I mean, I don't think that any of them are saying anything that they don't agree with, and I don't think that, I think that's just, who they are, and they're all extremely successful in their own right. I mean, Substack has like little badges for like different levels of success. It's like, oh, you have hundreds of subscribers, you have thousands of paid subscribers, you have tens of thousands. They're all on that tens of thousands level.
I'm sure.
I am at the thousands level.
Congratulations.
But I should mention that thousands means you hit 1,000, and then they just sort of round up from there. So
I'm one of them.
There you go. Thanks.
So I'm at least 1/10%.
You may be putting me over the edge there. Who's to say? But yeah, I mean, I do like newsletters, though. I do like the potential for them and just how they kind of shake things up a little bit. But I also like the fact that while I am on Substack, and while Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, and Barry Weiss, all manner of other people are on there, it's interestingly like siloed, and not in a bad way. Like I don't. So like if you write like a blog on like Medium or something, like you'll, at the end of it, it'll be like more like this, and then it'll like recommend different articles. And so like it would always kind of suck to be like, why trans people should have rights, and then get to the bottom and it's like more like this.
Eric
why
Erickson.
Trans people should have no rights, and you're like, damn it, that's not what I want people to. That's the, it's like, I understand why it may be useful to have that sort of perspective, but at the same time, I don't want to be the one promoting it, and so that was actually one of the things that when I was making my decision to leave Media Matters, where I was working with Andrew Lawrence, among others.
And that's how you first came to our attention on the show. Was I asked Andrew, who should we have on the show? And I think he said, I can't even remember, maybe he connected us, but he's like, Parker Molloy is great. Okay, so there you go. He connected us.
I was listening to it was you guys were doing a Twitter chat or Twitter Spaces.
Twitter
thing,
Spaces with Andrew.
I was just listening to it. Yeah. And then we connected, and I was on an episode of the podcast soon after.
And then right after you, I didn't really know who he was. We had Eric Erickson on.
Eric Erickson, which
back
we
to that
are
Medium where.
Yeah, we you know what, we are, and as we are recording this on Pearl Harbor Day, I would like to also say sorry to Eric Erickson, who let's see. Yeah, it's the 7th anniversary of the time Eric Erickson tweeted, "Growing up, I remember my parents never letting us have Asian food on December 7th. They were children of World War II." And so he tweeted that 7 years ago
Asian
today.
Food. No,
Asian
never
food.
mind.
Asian
never
food.
mind.
Yeah. Don't need to get any more specific than a giant continent.
Like Japan and China were on opposite sides of World War II. Never mind the racism period.
Yeah. Yeah. And and so Gawker at the time decided to reach out to his mom to be like, hey, is this true? And she's like, no. Like so that makes it even worse. So just I was thinking about that. I ended up tweeting that out. I tweeted that and the SpaghettiOs Pearl Harbor Day post from 9 years ago, where it's the SpaghettiO holding a flag saying, take a moment to remember #Pearl Harbor with us. I miss when brands would just like go nuts on social media, like places that for a while they'd be like, yeah, let's have a 9/11 sale, or that was always the funniest.
The last time we got that was the blackout.
Oh,
Remember when all the brands virtue signaled and they just blacked out their profile for Juneteenth? But
yeah,
sorry,
that was
the SpaghettiOs one is.
yeah, the SpaghettiOs one, that is just burned into my brain for as long as I live. I'm gonna think of the spaghetti because people forget that and they think that they posted that on 9/11, but no, it was Pearl Harbor Day.
And then Sean Spicer today said, "Well, this was a day that'll live in infamy. It's D-Day."
And someone's like, D-Day is in June. Like, oh, sorry. Reminds me of when he referred to concentration camps as Holocaust centers.
We shouldn't be laughing.
I know, but
stuff,
at the same time, it's just like, how is this guy the press secretary?
Well, here's the thing. Just to close the loop on them, and then to talk about your Substack, and then we'll end here. From my perspective, I was never a social conservative. I was always socially liberal, despite working for one of the most social conservative members of Congress, despite working for the RNC when Trump was being racist. And there was always this conflict in me. And I knew I was full of shit. And I would tell people that they're full of shit that I was working with because I just didn't believe it. And, obviously you shouldn't probably do that. I would not change my time in those realms for anything because I was able to learn these movements.
I mean, shapes who you are.
Yeah, it shapes who I am for the better, but also like now I understand where the modern GOP is because I was literally in the birthplace of the modern GOP with the Tea Party and all that hatred and shit. But when I look at these folks, I only have my perspective. So I think that they're full of shit and that they're doing this because they can't be that stupid because the second Twitter files, and you tweeted something out today about this, the big news was that the general counsel of Twitter used to work at the FBI. And the big news was that Elon didn't know that until Sunday. But you tweeted out something showing that he knew that back in April.
Yeah.
So how can you, as a arbiter of truth in this instance where you're Barry Weiss and you're speaking power to the man and whatever else she thinks, are they just not that intelligent? Are they so biased they're careless? Help me. Or do we just not know? I take the most cynical perspective possible.
Yeah,
I think they're full of shit.
I mean, God, I think I think the confirmation bias is strong, and I think that people may be smart and people may know what they're may genuinely believe things they say that aren't necessarily true. And I think that part of that is that they filter in information that confirms what they think, and they filter out things that don't. And that's kind of, I mean, what we were getting at earlier when we were talking about how fragmented media is these days and how easy it is to find something that just confirms what you think, and makes you feel smart, and makes you feel like, yeah, you're on top of things, and oh no, you're not clueless, you know exactly what's going on,
you're in the in-group.
Your solution to the war in Ukraine, yeah, that's the correct one, you knew it, and it's like, all right, okay, and I think that probably factors into a lot of it too. I think that while there are obviously people who are just hacky partisans, I think there are a lot of people who they think that they're telling the truth. They think that they're fighting the good fight, and even when it's very obvious to a lot of people on the outside that they're not. But
your tweet was hilarious.
Thanks. But it's all subjective.
To a point, it's subjective, I would argue. I think that there's a lot of objective stuff. But
yeah.
As we wrap up here, because we've gone over time, well over time, I know that, I wanted to discuss the media with you because of a variety of reasons. I read your Substack, The Present Age, and specifically, I saw Margaret Sullivan retweet your one of your articles. I cannot remember for the life of me what it was, but it's like whenever I want commentary on the media, which is obviously our subject today, I read your Substack. And then the other day I saw Mehdi Hassan tweet out like, Parker, why can't I retweet this? This is a great article. Yes. And I say this because I truly do think, and I disagree with most of or a lot of your political takes. I wouldn't say most. I wouldn't say most. Because my problem with progressives more is the candidates suck and they are a lightning rod rather than the policies. I don't really necessarily disagree with all the policies. But what article did you have the most fun writing it, and you think maybe had a lot of impact? Not necessarily what article got the most viewers or listeners, but if you were to just pick an article that was fun and you thought it had a unique perspective, could you just briefly describe that so we can get a feel for a little bit of what people would be subscribing to?
Sure. So after the midterms, I made the argument in my November 15th post. I wrote, the clear message in the midterms: the press is out of touch with the public. And so my argument here, which was, after the 2016 election, there were these questions: how did the media get it so wrong? How did the media get it wrong? We have to figure out what we're doing wrong. And the answer, as I kind of pointed out, was mentioned earlier, was, hey, let's hire Brett Stevens and Barry Weiss to come over from the Wall Street Journal to give us more of a conservative look at things, which kind of missed the fact that like Trump's win wasn't necessarily like a win for conservatism. It was, he would go along with whatever the Republican Party wants. But he's just a reactionary, and so when you hire people who aren't necessarily reactionaries to take that on, you're not giving us more insight. You're just kind of setting us up for weird stories. Like you had, the Washington Post in 2017 wrote an article that had the headline, "In a pro-Trump town, they never stopped saying Merry Christmas." And it's like
no one ever stopped saying Merry Christmas.
No one did. Like what, and between that and the diner safari type things, where it's like you're just going and interviewing random people and being like, oh, let's see. Oh, yep. Turns out Trump supporters still like Trump, even though he didn't make good on whatever promise. And so my argument in this piece was, and I tried to provide data, and I tried to make a compelling argument, is that the media has moved pretty far to the right and really missed the midterms. I mean, as bad as they missed the 2016 election, which, I wouldn't even necessarily say that they missed it so much as just they underappreciated Trump's chances, because they were still covering, they covered it fine. They, in fact, you think about the various stories that shaped it. New York Times broke the Clinton email server case. Like that was the one of the big stories. But they went through this thinking like, oh, how did we miss this? How could we do better? What could we change? And then they did things that didn't help them get to those places. And I feel like it's only made them less in touch with the public. And I make an argument. I make an argument that that guys like Chris Cillizza were totally out of their element. I mean, he had I just put screenshots of a bunch of his like midterm articles up there. It was like, why Republican attacks on crime have been so devastating for Democrat. The bottom is dropping out of the 2022 election for Democrats. He wrote that on November 1st. The Senate playing field is moving towards Republicans. And basically, like, all of his stuff was just so far off. And it's like, how does this guy still have a job? And now he doesn't. But he's like, while I feel bad about people who lost their jobs, obviously, I don't feel bad for Chris Cillizza. I just can't. I can't. And he will be fine, but I can't feel bad for him. The narrative was from the start that Republicans were going to perform well in the midterms, and he kind of kept going with that. And you point to polls that could tell you whatever you want, and that's another issue that sort of comes up. So I think that what I had hoped was after the 2020 election, after Trump lost, that there would have been maybe a little more reflection in the press, maybe a little like, hey, the past 4 years were kind of weird. Maybe we should do something about that. But it didn't really happen, and it didn't really happen after when Democrats retook the House in 2018. It didn't happen after Democrats won in 2020. It didn't happen, after the midterms. It seems like it's just mostly people losing their jobs, and no one, like, who knows what things will look like 6 months from now in the world of political media. But I try to, one thing I like to do in my work is to link to a lot of different things. My page basically looks like like any article of mine ends up looking kind of like a Wikipedia article, because you have links to, like, hey, here's this thing here, I'm explaining why, this goes back to this and this, I create these.
You cite your sources.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I link to things that I don't like. It's like, okay, I'll link to Breitbart, like these sorts of things when it's relevant, and that sort of stuff, where I don't want to trick someone into having the same views as me, or to have views closer to mine. I want to make a persuasive case. And so I try to do that. And sometimes I just put things out that are kind of fun and lighthearted and jokey. Like, my most recent one is like, hey, it's going to be a bad time for the media industry. And then I have a Johnny Cash song in there. Like, that's another fun thing about doing a newsletter, is you can kind of mess around with the formatting a little bit, as it suits you.
Awesome. Well, Parker, thank you very much for joining us. And if you're interested, folks, in subscribing to The Present Age, there's a link down below on the podcast description. So I suggest that you check it out, especially if this is your first time hearing Parker. I say this as a moderate, centrist, liberal Democrat, that she is literally one of two Substacks that I pay for. And the other media is the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times. So anyways, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.